Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back, or welcome to the Institute of World Politics. I would like you to observe a moment of silence to remember 9/11 and Warsaw Uprising. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to start with a little show. Can we play a clip? Yes. Or we have a couple of clips of commemorating. Now, not only is the clip homemade, but what you see here is homemade by soccer fans, mostly soccer hooligans because they are the most hardcore. They remember. And it is like this throughout Poland. Okay. Okay. See, I always tell my students to learn maps. They think that compass and maps are irrelevant because we have GPS. I tell them when our special forces go roaming, it stops working. We call it sound. It's called technology. Somehow, technology has not delivered utopia. It is very handy, but I strongly suggest that students learn that 2 + 2 = 4. That's going to come in handy, just like the maps and anything else. At any rate, one of my professors, the most recognizable historian of Poland who writes in the English language, Norman Davies, stressed that 9/11, during the Warsaw Uprising, every day as many people died for 63 days as on 9/11. Every single day in Warsaw, mostly civilians. Yet, the Poles commemorate the uprising, such carnage. For similar reasons, Americans commemorate 9/11. That was a crushing defeat, a failure of our intelligence community, a failure of our government. Americans remember. Why? Well, we pay respect to victims. I've received a few emails basically saying, how dare you posit a question like this? Why Poles commemorate defeat? Well, it was a defeat. There are a number of reasons. One of them is American. They commemorate the victims, the innocent victims who were in the right. The Poles commemorate other things too, and I'll get there as soon as we can resolve technological problems, but it is our duty to remember about those who came before us and sacrificed. Simply, it's our duty to commemorate. That's how we establish a chain of continuity. After all, we, as Americans, or as Poles, or Japanese, cannot be invented ex nihilo. We have superseded those who came before us and shaped the way that our nation is. And we inherit from them that which we choose to inherit. And one mark in Western civilization is to commemorate the dead. If you remember, great Greek plays revolve around the duty to bury the dead. The American military says, no man or woman left behind, not the dead. Everybody comes home. Enormous resources are expanded to account for the missing in action in Southeast Asia. When Poland regained her independence in 1918, one of the first things that the independent state did, after fighting 5 wars, including one against the Bolsheviks in 1920, which was the only time the Red Army was defeated in the field ever. The Polish state, the Polish parliament and the government and the people, at least conscious among them, went about commemorating the uprisings, in particular the uprising of 1863. Every single living insurgent was venerated. Those who couldn't fend for themselves were put up in retirement homes at state expense. The commander-in-chief, Marshal Joseph Pilsudski, issued an order where every single rank had to salute, including himself, had to salute the veterans of 1863. When my great-grandmother died, a platoon of lancers escorted her to her grave because she was one of the insurgents. And that was the case with every single insurgent who survived to see free Poland following 1918. It was something assumed. One had to commemorate it, to give meaning to the struggle for freedom. And the uprising in 1963, as nearly all other Polish uprisings except the Great Poland uprising of 1918, all uprisings failed. So one of the reasons is to commemorate victims. Another reason is to commemorate the struggle for freedom. And still another, to stress continuity between generations, that things dear to others are universal and we embrace them too. Further, it is to mark one's own willingness to sacrifice when the moment comes. And thank God for technical difficulties. I'd like everyone to recognize General Rowney, who should be in my stead. The general did not participate in the January Rising of 1863, but more or less in everything else ever since. So I'm very happy he is our friend and he comes here quite frequently. I'm very pleased to see it. Okay. Now you know I can connect to the internet and I can show it to you on my computer. Okay. I'm sorry?
It played before.
Okay. So you can you connect to the internet?
Yes, we're connected.
Okay. Okay.
Too many cooks.
Now, it was not customary to sing the national anthem before club games. National soccer matches, yes, but not club games. Soccer hooligans made it obligatory. Who doesn't sing gets beaten up, so everybody learns. You want to attend soccer games, you better show respect for the insurgents, for the military, not for the communists. So if you have time, you want to Google anti-communism and Polish soccer stadiums, it's very hardcore. They think it's 1944. And here's another one. Let them tell us that this was a disaster and defeat. That one should not commemorate what soccer club known as Wrocław pays its tribute to Warsaw insurgents. That's more or less what it says. We remember. Remember, this is all homemade. It's a government which is liberal, does not encourage. It tries to participate in the commemoration. The usual chant is Cześć i chwała bohaterom, which means glory to the heroes. And the kids chant the same thing on the streets when they march to commemorate the anniversary of the uprising.
They're still playing the game, so this is not
No, this
official.
Nothing is official. It's all spontaneous and grassroots. It's not government made.
And this is another club team?
This is another. This wasn't Legia. The first one was Legia, which is in Warsaw. This one is in Silesia, Śląsk Wrocław, which likes to call itself Lwów Wrocław. Because many people in Wrocław were deported from Lwów, which was in central, southern Poland before World War II. Now it's in Ukraine. As Professor Adam Ulam of Harvard, who was born in Lwów, used to say, Lwów is the Polish city temporarily occupied by the Soviets. And they sing. Now, on August 1st, 1944, the kids swarm in every major intersection in Warsaw, blocking traffic, burning flares, and chanting, and the life comes to a standstill for 3 minutes. Everyone shows respect. And it's entirely spontaneous. So this is what flash mobs do. Instead of going to malls and beating people up, that's what they do in Poland. They remember, because they care. At any rate, I remember, there you go, Old Town, we shall defend you faithfully. This is a mural in Warsaw. That is another soccer club, Polonia. The graffiti is spontaneous. This is not government made or approved. Instead of defacing walls, they remember history. You have a German tank and 3 insurgents, boys and girls. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Well, not yet. Let me. Anyway, do you remember watching Braveheart? The Scots argued with one another, and one of them said, "Well, let's go fight British," and another interjected, "Are you crazy? There are too many of them." Well, a third one chimed in and said, "Oh, we don't have to win. We just have to fight." I thought they were Polish. When the uprising broke out in Warsaw on August 1st, 1944, it came in the wake of a long insurrectionist tradition. There is, until this very day, tradition in Poland to remember not only Warsaw Uprising, but everything, all uprising. There are masses, people go to church, they visit graves, and they learn about uprising. And this was the case under the most inhospitable conditions, including under communism. I was told from when I was, I think, 3 or 4 years old about our ancestors participating in uprisings. One of them signed the Kościuszko insurrection in 1794. Another fought with Napoleon's legions. He perished at Zaragoza. Still others participated in the November insurrection of 1830-1831. I even have a document. He fired at the Cossacks and fled to the rebels. Therefore, wolne and przypust would be confiscated from the family. That's on my mother's, on my father's mother's side. On my father's father's side, that was in the eastern borderlands. Same story. Because my foster father's sister married a Platter, I was regaled with tales of Emilia Platter, who was an 18-year-old colonel in the Polish cavalry. The Countess Platter raised the regiments and fought in the 1830 insurrection. She died, but the duty was to remember and respect. I was also told similar stories about the 1863 insurrection. My grandmother's grandmother hid an insurgent courier from the Cossacks under her skirts. So when I was a little bit older, meaning a teenager, I made some unbecoming jokes about that. But I was fascinated by the story. I remember she was a cavalry woman. She fought as a lancer, and she was slashed with a Cossack saber across her cheek. And I was told that to patch her up, a cobweb was used, stale bread, and honey to keep this together. I said, hey, the Poles invented penicillin. I didn't know it was penicillin, but I thought it was, wow, marvelous. Folk medicine at work, 1863. And of course, I was told that naturally there were confiscations and the family was sent to Siberia. My great-grandmother hid in the neighborhood, and she became déclassée. She married her father's coach driver, who was only petty nobility. Imagine that. Oh well, they had a coat of arms, so everything was fine. It's Poland after all. Free farmers are nobility in Poland. So now almost anybody in Poland can claim descent from nobility and embrace insurgencies. Insurgencies are extremely important for national consciousness. If you're Polish, you love them, you treat them as a part of you. I remember communist historians mocking the fact that some 70% of Polish officers before the war, and in the cavalry over 90%, wore family rings with coats of arms. Well, guess what? About 75% of them were of peasant origin. Communists mocked it as snobbery. No, the officers embraced tradition of Polish chivalry. They wanted to be knights, and they knew they were knights. And as World War II showed, this was people like that who sacrificed. You embrace tradition. This has nothing to do with snobbery. That's why you commemorate everything. Nobody has forgotten about the Battle of Grunwald, where my ancestors trounced the Germans for 500 years. This was July 15th, 1410. But even if your ancestors were not at the battle, and you consider yourself Polish, then you rejoice and you remember about things like this. In fact, there is almost no difference between that and remembering the uprising. The importance of continuity was driven home to me and demonstrated in a conscious manner when I was, I guess, in my 20s, late 20s. I met Colonel Jurewicz, who died in Chicago when he was 103. We were chatting about friends and family before the war. He said, oh, remember, we were in Hodovo on maneuvers in 1935. I said, I remember perfectly. This was the Korwin-Wołeko estate. They're friends of ours, so I know where you were. And so we were chatting about things like this, and the colonel sometimes would reminisce about wars, disasters. As a teenager, he was a volunteer in the Polish-Bolshevik War, then he fought the Germans in 1939. And the colonel one time says, you know, after the Polish-Bolshevik War, I was in the cadet officers' school. This was 1922. And General Tachanowski came to see us. I responded, okay. And then I said, I'm sorry, wait a minute, what? General Tachanowski was a general in the insurrection of 1863, and he came to see you? The colonel looked at me as if I was insane, and said, of course, his grandsons were in the cadet officers' school with me. So this was perfectly natural to have continuity. And that is something what the communists attempted to tear away from the Poles. They suppressed it, terrorized it. Then they mocked it as snobbery. If anybody remembers anything from one's family's history, this is considered, even today in some circles, inappropriate. Those circles are post-communist mostly these days. Well, they don't really have anything to remember of their families unless you're going to be proud with your association with the secret police. So I understand why they don't want to remember, and the best weapon against those who remember is to mock. So now the Poles remember because kids like this have resurrected that which the communists thought they had destroyed, but which the kids rediscovered and relinked themselves to the past. As I said, this is completely spontaneous. And like in the interwar period, currently there are people looking for dead bodies from the war and from the aftermath of the Second World War. Some of them are my friends, like Dr. Krzysztof Szwagrzyk, who at least for 20 years has been digging for bodies of people executed by the communist secret police, some of them Warsaw insurgents. But we'll get there in a second. This mind frame of remembering, of course, comes in handy in Poland because for the past 300 years, it's been downhill for my family. Since 1772, because my family is from the province of Vistula. It's the easternmost province of Poland, about 300 miles west of Moscow. That's where the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania ended. So if you are taught to respect and remember, it means you are taught to be ready for a conspiracy, for an uprising. When I was young and beautiful, in Scotland, strikes broke out in Poland. So I knew what I was supposed to do. Hop on the train, hop on the ferry, hop on the train, get to Denmark, and get to Poland. This was September 1980. Well, my family in the West, of course, was not too happy because they wanted me to be alive, unlike very many members of our family. Alive for a long time. So for me, this was a logical step. I was 18 to return to Poland. And I was there. It was boring under Solidarity. All they did was smoke cigarettes and talked. And the dinosaurs told me, the insurgents and others, friends of my grandparents, are they crazy? They're not even hiding. The communists will come and crush them. This is exactly what happened. So when martial law was imposed, I was ready. I was with the Independent Students' Union Underground, and I thought that there would be an uprising. Thank God there wasn't one, because we would have been all slaughtered. But that's what young boys and girls have no brains, and that's what they want. That's what they want. Because they're taught about right and wrong. They're taught about sacrifice. They're taught about freedom, which we commemorate. And we thought we were continuity of the struggle. We thought, the people I associated with thought that World War II didn't end, and actually didn't end until the last Soviet soldier left Poland in September 1992. When I was growing up, one of the dinosaurs in my family's milieu was Jan Rossmann. He was the second in command of Grey Ranks, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, Girl Guides and Boy Scouts in the underground. I just loved up his stories. Jan Rossmann received Poland's highest military decoration, the Virtuti Militari Cross, which is, if America had something above the Congressional Medal of Honor, think catching a German tank with your teeth. then that would be the equivalent of the virtuti militari. Now remember, the Polish army has no wounded badges, no Purple Hearts, because then the whole army would be decorated. They don't have anything like this. But in this instance, in Jan Rosman's instance, he received his virtuti militari during the Warsaw Uprising. As a second lieutenant and a civil engineer, that was his education, his degree. He descended into a sewer to unclog it. Why? Sewers served as venues of communication between disparate parts of Warsaw. And the Germans built a barricade, dammed the sewer, so it became not passable anymore between the northern suburb of Żoliborz and the old town. So Pan Janek, as I call him when I was a kid, took another friend, descended into the sewer, approached the barricade up to here in feces, because the sewer was down, calculated by touching a booby-trap down barricade inside the sewer, by touching and by approximating, calculated how much explosives should be used to blow up the dam without damaging the sewer. And he did it. He said the hardest thing was when the whole thing floated. There was really not much to grab on. So he was floating with his friend, with it. They finally grabbed some kind of an iron bar, and that's how they survived. He was decorated for, pardon my French, dipping himself in feces with the highest military decoration. I thought it was great, and immediately went to the sewer. My mother was not too happy. I was 10. So, we not only commemorated uprisings, not only remembered the Warsaw Rising as the most chronologically close to my times, but we also were lucky enough to meet some of the survivors, and we dwelled on individual actions. The point is that the dinosaurs showed me and my sister and our peers and our milieu that no matter how bad it is, imagine the whole Nazi army on this side, the whole Soviet army on the other, no matter how much it is, the individual is free. If you're Polish, you're free. The individual is free, free to act. And that's what we also commemorate. As I've mentioned to you, I've received a few emails about the title, Commemorating Defeat. A couple of them angry. We don't commemorate defeat. The Poles commemorate the spirit of freedom. Yes, within the context of defeat. I'm very proud of my ancestors at the Battle of Kirchholm in 1605. 5,000 hussars kicked 21,000 Swedes into the sea, and I was there in 1605. I'm very proud of it. But I'm also proud of my family in the Vilna Home Army, you see. So it makes no difference from the individual point of view. What makes a difference if you volunteer to serve a cause that's greater than you. And that's what the Poles remember. This does not excuse us from looking not at individual sacrifice and heroism, which is beyond any doubt, but it doesn't excuse us from looking at uprisings critically. When you peruse Hansard's British parliamentary papers, you will discover that many of the English were dismayed, even if you look at the papers. Sure, there was sympathy with the cause, because who would not identify with the cause of freedom? But in France too, there were people dismayed. Why would the Poles rebel in 1830 when there was no army marching to their rescue? They just had themselves to count on, and Russia had Europe's largest army. Sure, they're brave, but did they have to fight just then? Shouldn't uprisings be coordinated with allies or with a stronger party? Shouldn't uprisings result in liberation because they are rational, they are calculated, like the uprising of 1918, where the people of Great Poland, Wielkopolska, Poznania and Pomerania rose and kicked the Germans out. And they won without any help, because theirs was not a romantic endeavor. Theirs was a hard-headed calculation. People of Western Poland are the closest to Germans we have in Poland. So they knew how to do business, including the business of uprisings. And when they launched theirs, everything worked out, just as it should have, in 1918. Not a moment sooner. Not in 1914, where Joseph Piłsudski and his friends came across the border. Actually, Piłsudski stayed in Krakow, but his first company came across the border and attacked the Russian Empire. And all the troops who were supposed to be in the cavalry were carrying saddles on their backs because they didn't have any horses. And everybody, almost everybody they encountered thought they were crazy. The gesture was grand and romantic, but I don't think was thought through. There was a real threat that had an uprising broken out in Poland in 1914. The Germans and the Russians would have made friends over the dead body of Poland, and there wouldn't have been World War I. Good for the world, but for Poland. So the objective of Piłsudski was to liberate Poland. Let the giants slug it out. When they stumble, slit their throats. I'm sorry to sound harsh. At any rate, let's look at the uprising of August and September 1944 in Warsaw. The Polish objective was to self-liberate. Why? Well, the Poles adhered to the doctrine of two enemies. Hitler and Stalin started World War II by attacking Poland in September 1939. It would be a joke to say that Stalin was coming to liberate anybody. The Soviet objective was to conquer as much Europe as possible. The Allied objective was whatever Stalin said. Uncle Joe was the cat's pajamas, especially for Roosevelt. Churchill was more cynical, and he knew who Uncle Joe was. But it didn't matter, because what mattered was that the Soviets bore the bulk of the fighting and the casualties, and not the Western Allies. Knowing that the Soviets were returning, the Poles launched a rolling insurrection. And Warsaw, from the very beginning, was specifically excluded from it. The so-called Operation Tempest commenced in January 1944 in Volhynia. Polish underground home army emerged as the 27th Volhynian Division, engaged the Germans and Ukrainian nationalists and cooperated with foreign elements of the Red Army. Then it turned out the Red Army tried to trap the Poles, so the Poles recrossed over the German line and began marching inside central Poland from the east. As the Soviets were approaching every point on the territory of pre-war Polish Republic, the Home Army sprang into action, and everywhere the scenario repeated itself. The Poles would fight the Germans, the Poles would assist the Soviets. After a couple of days, the Soviet secret police would show up, the Polish troops would be surrendered, disarmed, the officers shipped to Siberia, privates forced to enroll in the communist-led military units. Those who resisted were either shot or joined their officers on the train to the Gulag. In every single locality, including those that were freed by the Home Army without any Soviet help. The Home Army High Command in Warsaw was informed about it. There was no doubt in anyone's mind, no doubt that the Soviets could be trusted in any ways. All hope was that the Allies would intervene, but the Allies really didn't give a damn about the first ally, or the Poles. They convinced themselves there was nothing they could do, so they limited themselves to making impotent noises to Stalin. A debate raged inside Poland and in the Polish government in exile. Basically, nationalists, conservatives, center-right, centrists, and even socialists didn't want an uprising in Warsaw. The commander-in-chief, General Stalin, ordered from London that if the Soviets entered, the Home Army ought to cease fighting against the Germans. The Home Army should not engage the Soviets, and it should exfiltrate and send as many young men endangered by the communists to the West as possible. They should be shifted to the West. Polish Prime Minister in exile, who was a leftist, Mikołajczyk, deluded himself he could woo Stalin. On what grounds, I don't know. Poland had no diplomatic relations because Moscow broke them off with the government in exile following the revelations of the Katyn Forest massacre in April 1943. Stalin accused the Poles of aiding and abetting Nazi propaganda because the Germans revealed to the world that the Soviets had shot Polish officers in the Katyn Forest. Yes, as a matter of fact, 28,000 people were shot in that operation. The Germans only found 5,000 bodies, including a cousin of my grandfather, Lieutenant Simeon Kazimierz Chodakiewicz. The Poles in Poland knew from then on that the NKVD was involved. The Poles in exile did too. But Stalin used it as a convenient, cynical excuse to disavow the government in London, to break off relations. And the Prime Minister was naive, to say the least, without even using historians' 2020 vision, to have gone to Moscow to beg for help. And he didn't reach Moscow until the uprising was underway, so one doesn't know what he wanted to accomplish. Well, I'll tell you what he wanted to accomplish. He was trying to appease Churchill and Roosevelt because both statesmen to get rid of the Poles advised them. So he thought if he did that, then the West would be grateful. And Western statesmen were sick and tired of hearing about Poland's problems. Those weren't their problems. The Poles were no longer a sexy ally. The Soviets were. A debate raged within Poland too. Generally speaking, the right wing, center-right, center, and the socialists, but not liberals and populists, did not want an uprising. The socialists said, well, we can have an uprising in Warsaw, but only on the outskirts. When the last German soldier left, we can fire in the air or chase the last German soldier out. There were really no serious plans for the uprising in Warsaw. Secret weapons caches were depleted as late as July 1944 because the weapons were dispatched to eastern borderland to expedite Operation Tempest there. On orders of the commander-in-chief of the Home Army in Warsaw, Count Komorowski, General Bur, was his code name, a cavalry officer. Most in the Home Army High Command were opposed to the uprising in Warsaw. Then the Soviets approached. And it's important to remember the Soviet strategic and tactical battlefield modus operandi. The Soviets basically plagiarized what the Germans have done, called blitzkrieg. That means if someone proclaims that Brest or Brest is a fortress, then you just outflank it and surround it and let them steam. You storm ahead. This is called blitzkrieg. The Soviets, after the turning point of Stalingrad, never stormed a single city until they attacked Budapest in 1944. That was a frontal assault. And then Berlin. They avoided like a plague, engaging their forces in a frontal attack. Staff officers of the Home Army knew it. They had info from eastern borderlands, from the Intermarium, that the Soviet spearhead would outflank Minsk. The Home Army also knew that although most cities were outflanked and the Germans would vacate them and bolt, once in a blue moon the Germans would stop, like in Minsk, which was nearly leveled by the German forces, despite the fact that they had no chance, they stood no chance. So they were like track rats and decided to do as much damage as possible. So the Home Army knew that too. There was no way for anybody, well, there should have been no way for anybody to argue that the main objective of the Home Army was to capture the bridgeheads and secure the bridges across the Vistula. This made no sense. The Soviets never attacked frontally. If you even looked at the pincers the Soviet Operation Bagration produced in front of every town, including Vilna, they went to the south and north of each city, and then they met. And the Soviets then they would storm further west. Why did some people in the Home Army staff argue that the Soviets would storm Warsaw frontally? That's just bizarre. The Soviets could enter Warsaw, naturally, if it had been liberated by the Home Army, because then there would be no fighting. So then it would make sense to have the bridges secured and the approach secured. The question is, why, if the Home Army High Command knew that the Soviets were disarming and killing and shipping off to the Gulag Home Army soldiers? This is intelligence that the Home Army High Command had. Everything militiated against launching an uprising. Say the Poles won in Warsaw. What would have happened? Well, the Red Army would have arrived, the NKVD would have arrived, the Polish Home Army would have been arrested and shipped off to the Gulag. The unlucky ones would be shot on the spot. The lucky ones would have lingered, and probably a chunk would have died in the Gulag, as they did anyway. José Dumaitre, I think, said, sometimes the hardest thing to do is to do nothing. Well, but there were things to do. Operation Tempest was rolling across Poland's countryside. There was fighting all over the place. The argument that somehow young cadet officers and kids in the Home Army, including Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, would have started an insurrection without the Home Army High Command is a joke. The Home Army was an army. An army operates hierarchically. You get an order and you do things. Sometimes you have autonomy and you can do things on your own. But this was not a civilian enterprise. There was a way to deal with overexcited young men, stupid kids like me, who wanted to fight. You send them to the forest, because the forests were teeming with units of the Home Army. You simply dispatch the entire, or almost the entire garrison of Warsaw to fight in the countryside. This is what a smaller part of the National Armed Forces did. Creating the Holy Cross Brigade of the National Armed Forces, which, when the Nazi front collapsed, marched west and hooked up with General Patton, following the orders of the Commander-in-Chief in London, in their own little way. There was another unit that did a very similar thing, namely the Naliboki Home Army Regiment, which had fought both the Nazis and Soviets in the underground. Upon the approach of the Red Army, it packed up and marched, I don't know, 1,000 kilometers west, crossed the Vistula and joined the Warsaw Uprising. Because the German front was collapsing. So they marched with the Germans. The Germans said, "Ooh, exotic uniforms. Who are they?" But because the German troops were tired, everybody was tired, the Poles had picked up a few German military police who were tired, put them on their paddy wagons, and they were let through. Sure, along the way they had to yield to a couple of armored divisions, but those divisions didn't destroy them because they were too much in a hurry. They were regrouping. That's what you can do when the front is collapsing. These guys left sometimes in late May. Quite in Anabasis, all the way from Naliboki, which is northeast of Novogródek, what is now Belarus, all the way to Warsaw. And when they arrived on the western side of the Vistula River, they crossed a bridge which was manned by the Germans. The Home Army in the Campinos forest freaked out. They thought they were traitors. No, we are Home Army. We just marched with the Germans because everything collapsed. And they let us through. They even fed us on the way. So they had no idea what the heck we were. Even though we had Polish Eagles. And we have Lancers. And now they join the uprising. At any rate, there were ways. But there was no will, because there was a group of officers in the Home Army High Command who were hell-bent on the uprising. This is the way they rationalized it. Poland's mocked in the West. The Home Army is jeered at that we don't fight. This is all false, but the West doesn't know that we've been fighting here for many years, since before anybody fired a shot at Hitler and the Nazis. So we will show everybody that we're ready to fight, and we'll fight in Warsaw. That's one argument. Second argument, we'll win, and we'll welcome the Soviets as hosts. Oh, by the way, there was the orders for the home army in the eastern borderlands too. They did welcome the Soviets as hosts, and then they were sent to the Gulag or shot, like Lieutenant Colonel Maciej Kalinkiewicz and other friends of my family. But there was also a metaphysical dimension to the thinking or actions, I would say, not thinking, of a few high officers of the home army. Namely, their argument was as follows. It's horrible. The Soviets are coming. This is the end of the world. Whereas the Germans can kill our bodies, the Russians will kill our soul. We must do a horrific act of self-sacrifice so the future generations will remember that freedom doesn't come free. If you ask me for a metaphysical explanation, that's how a few officers on the home army, high command, effused. Didn't think, effused. Everybody dies so that everybody afterwards can remember. We shall take a stand. That was their approach. They went so far as to most likely falsify a report that Soviet tanks were seen on the outskirts of Warsaw, namely in the Praga suburb. That means 15 miles away. This was to sway and deceive the commander-in-chief, General Komorowski, who gave orders for the uprising to commence the following day. And because this was late in the afternoon, the runners, no one used phones because they were tapped, the runners didn't make it because of police curfew until earlier in the morning. And most units were not put on full alert. Only some of the elite units were fully mobilized, and not all of them, and not all the troops. The civilian population was not warned. When, in the 1960s in London, the dinosaurs talked among themselves, someone asked General Komorowski why he did not warn the civilian population. Well, there were leaks, just to let you know. For instance, our great aunt, Fabiani, was warned, and she left with 2 kids. Her husband had been killed, executed by the Nazis. He was an underground leader. So she was warned, and she left. So there was a leak. And she survived the uprising on an estate, on a friend's estate in the countryside. She was my grandmother's sister. Her last name is Fabiani. But General Boer responded, there was no time to warn the civilian population. No time. I didn't warn my wife. His wife was taken prisoner by the Germans. She was pregnant, and she was with her, I think, 3-year-old. And the Nazis put her in front of their German tanks as a human shield. And General Komorowski said there were very many pregnant women in Warsaw. I couldn't have possibly warned them all, so I didn't tell my wife. Remember, the mindset of some of the finest underground officers was chivalry. They were absolutely ill-equipped to deal with the totalitarians, with the Nazis and communists. Completely different world. A word about the Germans. Their objective was to kill everyone and to level the city. Why? Because Hitler issued such an order. And it took about a week until an SS general arrived, decided it was counterproductive, told his troops to shoot men only and chase all the women and children away. This was after a week of killing, where about between 30 and 60,000 unarmed civilians were slaughtered in the Vistula and Ochota suburbs. Some have argued, it's possible, that had the Germans concentrated on fighting the home army, the uprising would be over in a couple of days. But instead, they focused on killing, raping, and robbing civilians in Vistula and Ochota. A qualifier. When I say Germans, I must stress that a plurality of the Nazi forces in Warsaw were Soviets. They were former Soviet POWs who, to survive, went over to the Nazi side. That's a well-hidden fact. What were the Soviets of the Red Army doing? This is 16th Street. They were on 15th Street. Because in some places the Vistula River is that narrow as a city block in Washington, D.C. At worst, it's 2 blocks. And the Soviets sat there for 2 months, watching as the Nazis were doing their job for them. Watching. It only made sense. Why? The Polish Home Army, the Poles, were Stalin's enemies. That's how Stalin saw them. So they were delighted that the Poles were being slaughtered. They also denied the Allies, who didn't do much to help, denied the Allies the right to supply the insurgents. So the few drops that occurred were very convoluted. The Allies had to fly usually from Italy. Usually the crews were Polish, Canadian, South African, and British. They had to fly all the way from Italy, drop their load over Warsaw, and turn around. They really had 300 yards to save airfields that the Soviets were using, but they were not permitted to do so. Finally, the US, when the uprising was almost over in the middle of September 1944, took a whole air armada and just flew it, dropped its load, and landed in the Soviet-occupied territories. And they were not executed. Perhaps that should have been done within the first week of the uprising, because when the Americans came, 95% of all stuff fell into the enemy hand. Everything almost that they dropped fell into the hands of the enemy. Or Soviet hands. The Soviets were very happy to have been supplied, not the insurgents. Nothing was done to speak of. Don't take me wrong. Until this very day, American and other Allied pilots are revered and remembered. I was taken to a spot where an American liberator crushed, and the locals built a monument. And they remembered throughout the communist days when one was not supposed to remember. They would always light a candle there and mark it. Now there is a proper monument, an outline of a liberator. But really the Allies didn't do anything much for the insurgents. A word about fighting. The Home Army Command divided its forces into about 600 plus platoons. Even though on paper there was at least a division, only 1/4 of 25% of the troops had any weapons. Everybody else had bricks, or gas pipes, or brass knuckles, because the assumption was, straight from the insurrection of 1863, with our sticks we take their rifles, with their rifles we take their field guns, and then we win. That sounds infantile? Well, if you care, that's what you do. That's why young boys shouldn't be allowed to be in charge of any conspiracy, because they are crazy. And I know that from autopsy. We need General Rounded to tell us what to do. Otherwise, instead of landing on Incheon, we would have marched on Beijing immediately. And I'm not kidding. The Home Army failed to achieve most of its strategic objectives. So in essence, the German garrison was surrounded in Warsaw, but it wasn't defeated. The Home Army seized control of almost the entire town, and then it lost the city block by block. In particular, the fighting was horrific in the old town. The old town is the old medieval town of Warsaw. I don't know, this would be like starting with the mall, Treasury, Willard Hotel, beyond the White House to Lafayette Park, all the way to Army and Navy Club. It took the Germans 31 days to take it. They drove their tanks into the cathedral, St. John's Cathedral, where my grandparents were married. That's how bad it was. The Poles had a machine gun in the choir. So that's what I was told by one of my dinosaurs. You know, my trips to go to church were very eventful. It took 63 days. The Germans finally realized that rather than killing the Poles, they should compel them to surrender. And after 63 days, since there was no ammunition anymore and no help coming, the Poles surrendered. Now, let me put it this way. The Allies, once again, did nothing really. It took the Allies about 6 weeks to move over the proposition that the Poles were Allied combatants, that the Home Army soldiers should not be shot on sight. Finally, I think General Patton and others got peeved. And it was, I don't think it was a political decision, because they said they would start shooting German POWs. They were kidding, but the Nazis were Nazis. So they didn't think the Americans were kidding. All it took to stop shooting was to threaten. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was 6 weeks in the making. 6 weeks. Not acknowledging that there was an uprising, but not acknowledging the first ally, the first to fight against the Nazis and communists. The first ally as a fellow combatant. 6 weeks. Okay, now a word about the movie. Because the Poles are masters of illusion, nobody ever says anything straight. You're hungry? No, that would be rude to admit that I'm hungry. If I admit I'm hungry too fast, then everybody gets offended. But if I say no thank you, they're offended that I'm not eating. Okay. So the movie is full of illusions. Let me scramble it for you. Bad guys are Nazis, Soviets, and Polish post-communists. Yes, the movie is about the uprising, and it switches back and forth between contemporary times and the uprising. Number 2, uniquely in this movie, the Soviets fighting for the Nazis appear to be worse than the Germans. The director chose to differentiate between bad and good Germans, which is unusual. There's even a decent SS trooper, not NCO or officer, who are genocidal maniacs, but there is a single SS trooper, which is quite possible because the Germans deployed the SS Delewanger Brigade that was composed of concentration camp inmates, German concentration camp inmates, mostly rapists and poachers. But there were more than a few people who ended up in the concentration camp for black marketeering, and I don't think they would immediately make a good assessment. So this is very unusual for a Polish movie to differentiate that the Soviets are uniformly bad. And the most evil person, nefarious person in the movie in contemporary times turns out to have had connections to the communist secret police. And the last point, the heroes of the movie are the people of Warsaw, both past and present. And the leaders, galvanizing them to remember, are rappers, hip-hop artists. Because you thought there was only the skinheads and soccer hooligans who remember. No. Imagine if American rap commemorated 9/11 instead of talking about raping women and killing cops. Well, in Poland, hip-hoppers commemorated the uprising. It is a universal phenomenon in the Polish society among the young. You won't believe me when I tell you that even Citibank and the National Bank have taken to advertising the uprising when they want to encourage you to deposit their money with them or take out a loan. They have pictures of very attractive combat insurgent nurses. These are real pictures. I've even recognized a few people. Because that's how deeply now embedded everything is. Remember, the communists killed, terrorized, discriminated against, and persecuted the insurgents and their memory. I remember as a child going to the cemetery to clean the insurgents' graves, and we were threatened and ejected. This was in the 60s by secret police. They assembled and watched who came. They didn't like people to assemble in common. It was pushed underground. With each passing year, it grew stronger, it emerged bolder, and now it's out in the open. The chickens have come home to roost, and the young ones are very angry. And you see the anger here is directed mostly against businessmen who are identified as post-communists. There are no other businessmen, just post-communists. And they are universally hated. Enjoy them. Thank you very much.